Okay. First, I'm sure that there are, I hope, and I am absolutely convinced there's lots of questions buzzing in your mind. But Caroline, perhaps I could come to you first and ask, you agreed very kindly to chair the All Party Parliamentary Group on Limits to Growth. We launched that a couple of weeks ago. From a public perspective, it was packed out. We had people standing for 2.5 hours in the back of that room wanting to engage in that conversation. From a political perspective, we had 5 very dedicated parliamentarians turning up at it. From where you stand in policy, what is the challenge of creating this new debate, and where are the limitations of it?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on what sounds like such an exciting programme, and yeah, absolutely timely as well. And in terms of reflections on the sort of political constraints, if you like, I think 2 things actually at the same time. I think on the one hand that there is a new appetite, that we are just catching the cusp of a wave, if you like, and that the very fact that there is an all-party group that is called Limits to Growth, that to me is quite remarkable. I mean, I must admit, I did have a conversation with some of the instigators of that all-party group saying, are you really sure you want to call it Limits to Growth? Because that might just reduce the number of people who will come. And, you know, it's politicians, as you know, don't like talking about limits to anything. So it's really just putting the taboo right up there. But I'm very glad that we did. And yes, 5 MPs don't sound that many. But actually, by Westminster standards, getting 5 MPs from a number of different parties to come along at a time when there's so much else going on is quite an achievement. So on the one hand, I think the one reality is that there is a sense of wanting to ask these questions, and that does feel a very timely moment. And it's partly, I think, because of the reality of the impending environmental crisis. I think it's partly because it's clearer than ever that economic growth isn't working even in its own terms, in terms of either delivering well-being across a wide group or indeed of being sustainable. In other words, economic growth itself is being recognised, I think, as increasingly uneconomic. The cost of cleaning up after the model of economic growth we currently have is actually probably costing us more than the value of the growth in the first place. So on the one hand, I think there is a dawning reality of all of that, and that's very exciting. On the other side is the reality, as I say, that politicians don't much like talking about limits to anything. We're just coming out of a recession. In some people's minds, a recession is the same thing as limits to growth, and therefore, you know, just crudely speaking, are we really suggesting that people all want to go back to recession? Well, of course we don't, and there's all sorts of arguments to be had about why the economic model we're talking about is very different from that. But nonetheless, in popular perception and in a media environment where you've probably got 30 seconds max to begin to be able to explain this stuff, I think that's going to be challenging. I think it's challenging for both politicians and business to go beyond efficiency to sufficiency. In other words, I think there's a lot of agreement, and business have been brilliant in the ways they've demonstrated just how efficient they can be, doing a lot more with a lot less in terms of that resource efficiency. And there are clear economic advantages of doing that as well, which is no doubt one of the reasons why business have picked up this agenda with such enthusiasm. But actually to take that to the politics of enough, the politics of sufficiency, the politics of not saying more and more stuff, I think is challenging. And certainly as a Green MP, I've tried it. And it can be really difficult. You know, nobody is marching in the streets of London with a placard saying, what do we want enough? When do we want it? Well, sometime soon would be nice. You know, people kind of want more. That is what the whole of the environment around us, the advertising industry, the politics, the economics around us, is designed to make us want to consume more. And as you've put it so beautifully in your book about the advertising industry, you know, persuading us to buy things we don't need with money we don't have to make the impressions that don't last. I mean, all of that stuff is very, very present. So to me, I think the heart of this is going to come down to how we position it and how we communicate about it, and how we really exploit the fact, if you like, that there's a real advantage to be had in the sense that if we really want, as I think people do, a more fulfilling life themselves, then the way to get that is precisely through doing the kinds of things that we need to do for social and environmental reasons too. In other words, all of that wonderful work that Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson did in the spirit level that showed us that inequality isn't only bad for people at the lower end of the ladder, which is fairly obvious, but actually a world of inequality isn't good for people higher up the ladder either, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of well-being outcomes, in terms of their sense of security and hope in the future. So if it can be demonstrated that precisely the kind of world that we need to be moving towards for social and environmental reasons are actually going to be giving us the conditions that we need in any case to lead more fulfilling lives, then that is a very happy bit of synchronicity, I think. And that is going to be the challenge, I think, politically. And to make the connections. You know, David Cameron, of course, a few years back spoke very eloquently of gross domestic well-being, gross domestic happiness. But of course, you don't hear so much about that language anymore. Now he's perhaps in a position to be doing more about delivering it. And also, you don't see the connections between the different policy areas. So Paris was wonderful in many ways. It wasn't as ambitious as we would have liked, but the Paris climate talks came out with something that was more ambitious than many of us thought we might end up with. And yet, the same politicians who on that day were saying how great it was that we had an ambitious agenda, relatively speaking, on climate change, the very next day were talking about the expansion of Heathrow Airport and how necessary that was for the economy, without any sense at all of any kind of cognitive dissonance between those two things. And I think a challenge will be to bring this debate, which some politicians will be happy enough to engage with and within the parameters of having this debate, to then take those same conclusions and apply it to real decisions in the real world right now. And I would argue that the logic of this debate is such that the question isn't, are we going to expand Heathrow or are we going to expand Gatwick? We are not going to be expanding airports full stop. But you challenge a politician to talk about that, it's much harder. So the first challenge is about making those connections between the different policy areas. And I think that second challenge is the exciting bit, the fact that the kind of world that we need to be grasping our way towards to make ourselves happier and more fulfilled is exactly likely to be the same kind of world with the same kind of conditions we need in order to be able to reduce inequality and increase sustainability.
Do you think this argument around what's happening in the economy more generally has any traction? Is there any sense that policymakers are wary of Plan A? If Plan A were just simply to keep going and keep growth going, is there any awareness that actually that could be an opportunity to talk about a different structure in the economy and a different set of priorities for policy?
I'd like to say that it is, but I'm not personally convinced yet that it is. I mean, I think that there is still so much effort to get back to the business as usual. I mean, you can see what's happening in terms of the way in which we've been able to massage some of the figures in terms of getting out of this economic difficulty is through, boosting the economy in very short-term ways, more personal debt, house prices, yet again, about to be another kind of speculative bubble. I mean, in many ways, it doesn't feel like we've learnt very much from the more recent recession. It feels like in many ways we're putting exactly back in place some of those same conditions. So although I'm certain that there are more of those conversations going on and there is some potential for a different logic, if you like, to take hold and a plan B to look more attractive, at the same time, I would argue that those people who are most close to the levers of power right now are, I would say, actually simply reinforcing the same, the seeds of destruction that we had the first time around. Okay,
I mean, obviously one of the things that policymakers do listen to is the voice of business. Karen, let me come to you. Unilever's been amongst the most proactive companies when it comes to thinking about sustainability and putting forward a vision of business for the 21st century that incorporates that. How does it respond to the depth of this challenge about redefining prosperity? And to what extent, taking our experience from this morning into account, to what extent do you think it is a realistic option for business to think about a model which is about more profit with less stuff?
Tim, first of all, I'd just like to say that I think it's fantastic that you've launched CUSP, and one of the things that I've been particularly impressed by and what you've laid out is that you've taken a very holistic approach right through from the arts to society to more systemic approaches, and I'd like to touch on this area around systems in a moment. I guess the first question is why is it important for business to engage at all? And as you've both referred to, I think some of the enormous issues that we're facing around climate change, around lack of security around food and growing inequality are all areas which for businesses are of enormous concern, because they set up the risks that a business that wants to operate into the long term needs to face, and even if we're not facing them today, that we could face in 5 years, 10 years or 20 years time. And I guess the way at Unilever we think about it is that you can't have a healthy business in an unhealthy world, whatever the different sort of areas of an unhealthy world. The way at Unilever that we've tried to approach these challenges is to set up a vision and a framework for our businesses to attempt to find different ways to operate. And of course, that's within the economic system as it exists today. So we set a vision 5 years ago, which was very informed by WWF's work on One Planet Living. This idea that if we were all to live the way we do here in the UK, that we would need 3 planets, not just one. Unilever is a global business. We have sales in many more than 100 countries around the world. And so thinking about how that Western model of business and of consumption would not translate as we take that forward has sort of shaped our vision. So we set a vision 5-6 years ago, which is to say that we want to grow our business, but we want to do so in a way that reduces our environmental impact and increases our positive social impact. And what I guess, was at the heart of this was to say that we want to shift from having, if you like, business here and charity or philanthropy or corporate social responsibility, as it's sometimes called, CSR, here, but that we wanted to find some different ways of operating which would integrate sustainability in its broadest sense with the way we do business. We have a name for that. We call that our framework the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, because and for us sustainability is not just about the environment, also about societal issues and concerns. And we set 5 years ago we set ourselves 3 big goals. We knew that we had no idea how we would get to these 3, and we're indeed finding that there are some real challenges to get there. So we said that we want to reach more than 1 billion people to help them take action to improve their health and well-being. We particularly focus on hygiene in the developing world around clean water, hand washing, and sanitation. Secondly, we said we want to halve the environmental footprint of our products, both focusing on our factories, but also across that whole life cycle from the way we source our raw materials through to consumer use. We're finding that very difficult. And in fact, we have not made the progress we'd hoped. And then finally, the last of our goals is to enhance the livelihoods of millions of people who are not only those working in our business, but, for example, smallholder farmers who are supplying us with raw materials and small-scale retailers who are in our distribution supply chain. And so they're looking at human and labour rights across the supply chain as well as in our own business and beyond. And I guess, I can talk further about the way the benefits we're seeing in economic terms for our business, because we are in terms of growth and cost reduction. But perhaps to reflect on a couple of the challenges that we're finding and that we found in this first sort of 5 years. I guess one is that, of course, we're a consumer goods company. We sell tea and shampoo and soap. And in our minds, what we had hoped for is that we would be able to help to shape behaviour change in ways that were more positive towards sustainable living. And we do believe that. We believe we've made some progress there. But we've also found challenges along the way. A small example of some progress recently. About a year ago, there was a big drought in Sao Paulo, and you were talking about young people in Sao Paulo. And so water was rationed. We sell laundry detergent there. We found that people were using a lot more water to wash their laundry than they needed to. So we ran a communication educational campaign, if you like, for people with our laundry brand, which is the equivalent of Persil in Brazil, encouraging people to cut down the number of rinses they do, and saying one rinse is enough. You don't need to do more than that. We feel we got a lot of traction with that. At the same time, we grew sales as well of our brand and an appeal for our own brand. That's one area, is consumer behaviour change, and the second is, I guess, that what we have realised is that we can make changes in our own company, for example, in our factories, to cut energy and waste, but those in the end are incremental shifts, and the challenges we face are much bigger and require transformational changes to whole systems, and that needs collaboration, which I think is very much at the heart of what you're thinking about with CUSP, of civil society, government, business and householders together.
Absolutely. But at this point in time, the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan still exists, is still core in your business. It is still a guiding vision for you?
Completely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, frankly, of course, when we first launched, we needed to learn a lot ourselves, and we still are. But it has become more important to us. It's more and more integrated. Okay.
Thank you for those introductory remarks. I want to throw it open a little bit for some conversation. I have a question here already, so if the microphones could be a little bit fleet of foot. Simon, do we have someone else on the mic? And okay, so I have two gentlemen here, one here, and the lady in the front row here. So if we could have the microphone, actually you pass that one on to the lady in the red dress, and a microphone here, please, for the other one. Okay, yeah, first question.
Is sustainable prosperity possible while the political system is owned by a few mentally ill people who have no concept of enough, who are siphoning the lifeblood out of the economy into the Ponzi schemes of the financial and property sector, and through the property sector are enslaving us into continual work, trying to keep up with the increase in house prices?
Okay, I'll resist the temptation to say that was a partly rhetorical question, but we will come back to it. I'll take three questions. So there's the gentleman there, if you could get the microphone there, and while you're doing that, the lady in the front row.
Thank you. I'm much more interested to understand the practicality, because this is supposed to be academic research, but how is this going to be? How are you going to make sure that this might be implemented as you go, rather than waiting for 10 years of accumulating some evidence before, getting that done?
Okay, very good question. And the gentleman here?
Jeff Beacon from the Pollution Tax Association. I'm worried about the remaining carbon budget, which DEC tell me is less than what the IPCC have laid out. And it seems to imply that we've got to not use less stuff, but a lot less stuff quickly. And given that 10% of the wealthiest people in the world, which probably includes a lot of us, are causing 50% of the pollution, and they are serviced by quite large companies with an interest in that. If we cut a lot of the polluting things, like concrete, steel, travelling, beef, we're going to have less production, less use of labour, so that'll squeeze the labour price, and the question of redistribution then comes relevant. And I think Hanson's carbon fee would do that, would cut carbon and redistribute wealth as well. I'd like a view on that, and a view on whether there is any hope of closing the politics-physics gap. The physics says we've got to do this, the politics says we can't.
Thank you very much. We'll just take those three very quickly. I mean, I will take the point about the impacts of CUSP quite briefly, but maybe Caroline, and Karen, your thoughts on the specifics of policy and also on the question of power, which I think is at the heart of what was being asked there. Are we in the hands of power-hungry psychopaths? And that's probably a little harsh way to characterize what you said, but it was along the lines of your intervention. And what can we do about that? Caroline.
Well, I do think that, yeah, it's a major challenge that so much of the influence over our political system and the political systems around the world are from the corporations. I mean, you only need to look at the US elections right now to see that the role of corporations in you know, trying to back particular leaders. I mean, maybe Bernie will win out, but at the minute, you know, you can just see how much big money is talking and how much politicians become indebted to corporate power in order to be able to deliver their program. So that is going to really challenge us. And I think one of the questions that didn't come out quite so explicitly in what you were describing is just sort of how compatible democracy is with with what you're what we're all aiming to achieve with the CUSP agenda. Now, by that, I'm not suggesting that I do think that we short-circuit democracy. I think it's got to be done in a democratic way, but I think the implications for our democracy are really fundamental in terms of changing our governance system, in terms of relocalizing it a lot more. I think it will have big implications for that. And I think the set of policies that we're going to need to get anywhere close to the carbon budgets that we need to try to meet are going to mean that we're looking at something that's far more holistic, perhaps, than changing certain aspects of our economy. And so to take up the challenge, in a sense, that you just set out, you know, I think as we depend less on growth for our aggregate resource, then redistribution is going to become absolutely key. And therefore, policies that are, the kind of policies that will reduce, for example, the discrepancy between the highest paid and the lowest paid in any particular corporation will come to the fore. I mean, we're going to have far more stress on redistributive policies in a world that is depending less on more and more aggregate growth. So that will be part of the policy mix that we're going to need to see. I think we're going to need to see a shorter working week and sharing out the work more widely amongst all of us. Now, what does that mean in terms of our take-home income, if you like? Well, then that takes us into debates about the basic income scheme, which I'm glad to see is something that is actually also just now gathering some greater interest in. And in fact, one of the reasons I need to leave early is because there's a seminar on that right now in the House of Commons on introducing a basic income scheme. So the challenges are big, and it just struck me as well when Karen was talking that, you know, I applaud everything that Unilever is trying to do, and your honesty with trying to do that too. But I think one of the things you described there was an aspiration to halve the ecological impact of your operations, if you like. But if at the same time you're also doubling your sales, then where does that take us? So the challenges are big.
Karen, do you want to come back? I mean, particularly maybe on that point, you know, you're halving impact, but your aspirations to double sales, and it does speak to our conversation this morning about more profit from less stuff. If it's only efficiency gains and the scale is increasing, where does that leave your model?
Well, I think it is, although efficiency gains are important, aren't they? And I think you acknowledge that, and that's an area where I guess business does have a lot of capabilities. They're not enough, but they take us a certain amount of the way. I mean, we've seen in our own company, we've cut our greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% now, 39% over the last few years in our own factories. But yes, they don't take us far enough. Our next step is we have now said that we want to go to carbon positive by 2030, and that what we mean by that is 100% renewable energy, both electrical and heating, by 2030, 100% electrical energy renewable by 2020, and to go beyond that and be able to find a way to generate enough renewable energy that we can give back to the communities around the factories. Now, we're just one company, but I think that there is a coalition of companies who are increasingly stepping up. And I think 2015 was was a tipping point year for a number of big companies, but both because of the climate change discussions in Paris and because of the Sustainable Development Goals that were ratified by the UN in September last year, and which, if you like, are a to-do list for governments and business and civil society across a range of sustainability challenges that face the world. So what I see, I guess, is that a number of companies are prepared to step in and not only make those efficiency gains, but be part of the more transformational shifts that require collective action.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to your question. I want to hold it right to the end, partly because I have an answer, but not an entirely satisfactory one. And I want to take another round of questions. So I have, do we have a microphone in a particular place at the moment? You have, if you could take one question here from the gentleman in the pink shirt, and then the next, the lady in the third row there, and then the gentleman at the back who's had his hand up for a time. If you could get that microphone to the back there. Yes.
Picking up something that Tim has said and something that Caroline has said, I come to the conclusion...
Green shirt, sorry.
This is not going to be a painless process. And I admit to having a little bit of a hair shirt in the way I live. But it seems to me that we've got to get a better link between the stuff we buy and the consequences of that for the atmosphere, the oceans, the biodiversity. Unless we can build that link, and whether it's the finance community or whether it's the business community or the government, without that link, we're not going to make much progress.
Thanks. If you could take that mic round there, and while you're waiting, yes, the gentleman at the back.
Hi, my question is with regards to renewable energy. Someone just said about it earlier. And there's quite a few reports now actually asking, as I've been asking for the last 5-10 years, is just like we ask where fossil fuels come from, which is coal or oil, where does all the minerals for renewable energy come from? I've spoken to people from the Green Party, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace. No one seems to be wanting to give me an answer. And I can tell you where it comes from. It comes from places like Congolese in Africa. It comes from places like Jharkhand in India, sacred religious forests, and it's conflict minerals, and it's up to 200 minerals. And there's been quite a few organizations done reports on that. And when I've challenged people, they say, well, we need energy from somewhere. I says, but to get those minerals, we have raped and pillaged the soil and the people to get those minerals. Is that acceptable that we just take such a single-minded view and actually not go life cycle analysis of where these minerals come from for our needs in the West? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, quite related points in a sense, that the reality, the materiality of our supply chains and the meeting of our needs has to somehow be brought to the fore in those conversations. The lady over here.
Hi, my name's Emily Benson. I'm with the Green Economy Coalition. I was just curious to know, I mean, we may all have cynicism or be skeptical of how successful UN processes are, but we do now have a set of UN Sustainable Development Goals, 17 action areas. I'm wondering whether they are deemed useful, either in politics or in a business framework, and if they're not relevant on the agenda, then how can we as the public or as institutions help to champion those SDGs as one mechanism for progress?
Okay, so the materiality of our supply chains, and in particular the hideous impacts that it has somewhere else, and then can SDGs save us? Karen?
So the better link between the stuff that we buy and the consequences of that, and that hits to it's the heart of the question, isn't it? It's something I feel personally care very personally about, and I think it's partly because of my own career. I guess I've spent all my career in Unilever. I started as a graduate trainee in marketing. You know, I've shifted into the sustainability area in the last few years, and so that has made me reflect a lot on, you know, what I not only my own personal life but also marketing as well. And as a business person, not asking those questions, let alone as an ordinary citizen. So I think there is a real onus on business to think through and understand that total supply chain. What I see is an increasing expectation from people that business should do that, and I'm optimistic about that. We have just completed some research across a number of large countries: Brazil, India, US, UK, and Turkey, where we were looking at those questions, asking people what's important to you when you. In our case, you know, we're interested in why people use our products, why they buy them. And they said, well, I want the right price, I want a good quality performance. But for a very large number of people nowadays, they're also saying, well, I want a sustainability benefit, whether that's around ethical sourcing or around the use of natural resources. There's a whole range of different areas that people are interested in. We were seeing that as many as 54% of people were saying that is something that they want to see coming from the brands that they buy. And we were surprised by how mainstream that was and encouraged. So I think that gives us an impetus because of the pull factor, the demand is there. Shall I address shall we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals as well?
If you have
yes, I guess.
Response.
So yes, well, we felt very privileged at Unilever because our CEO Paul Polman was invited to join the high panel that did some of the early thinking around the Sustainable Development Goals. So as a company, we feel a very strong connection to those 17 global goals and believe that a number of them are very relevant to us as a business, whether that's around climate change or food supply chains and agriculture or water and sanitation. So we think they are very relevant and useful. I think there's a lot more that could be done to create broad awareness of those Sustainable Development Goals, and the role that I think that citizens can play is in becoming aware of them and holding their governments and corporations to account to deliver against them. They're becoming more and more specific with clear KPIs against them.
Thanks, Karen. Caroline.
Yeah, maybe on that last one first. In terms of the SDGs, I mean, they are very important and within the particular silo of government at any particular time, they will have some leverage. But I worry again that there's not very much read across between what happens when you've got one set of ministers going off and signing up to them and another set of ministers who are giving the green light to yet more fracking, yet more tax breaks for fossil fuel extraction. There just, again, seems to be this dissonance in terms of making the connections. And I think that is the real challenge for us. And I think I want this to be a positive discussion and a hopeful discussion. And I was thinking of, you know, in what ways is that hopeful? And I think what is hopeful is that in terms of what we need, essentially what we need is more courageous politicians, it seems to me at least, who will have the courage to put forward more ambitious policies in any of the areas that we're talking about right now. And the way in which I think they're going to be given courage is by thinking that they're not going to be punished at the ballot box for doing it. And that then brings back power to you, I think, all of us. But I mean, in terms of, I noticed when I was looking through the numbers of people who are here, there are quite a few people from the Transition Town movement. One of the reasons I love the Transition Town movement is because it's not only just people just getting on with stuff and not waiting for governments or corporations or anyone else, but it's also about demonstrating the appetite and the willingness to make sometimes difficult decisions, but to make decisions in a community to do things differently and to have that power of a good example of people doing that. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that, because the more, you know, we can give some courage to politicians, and I'm sorry it has to be that way around. You know, you elect politicians and you hope they're going to show leadership and always do the right thing, and I'm afraid sometimes they don't, and they need to feel that it's safe to move in certain directions, and that means that on quite a few areas, politicians are actually lagging behind where the population is, where business is sometimes too. So if we could do more to be able to demonstrate that actually there is an appetite in recognising that actually stuff isn't the be-all and end-all to our lives, that we want more fulfilling lives, and if that means, in some senses, less stuff, then that's great. And it doesn't have to mean shivering around a candle in a cave. It can actually mean a higher quality of life with more fulfilling relationships. You know, there's the usual thing people say, isn't there, about how when you're on your deathbed, not many people think, you know, damn, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. They are more likely to be thinking, you know, I wish I'd spent more time with family or friends or doing the things I love to do. And sort of taking that very basic and obvious insight, but trying to work back from that. And I think there are some straws in the wind that suggest that people are thinking that. So for those people who are lucky enough to be in relatively well-paid jobs, if they're offered more money or less time, increasingly people are actually thinking they would like to not take more money, but actually take more time and not be working 60 hours a week or whatever. I mean, that's just a small, you know, a small signal in the wind, if you like, and it only applies to a small number of people in the very luxurious position of being able to make that decision. But perhaps there is a sense, at least, in which people are recognising that this is something that they do want to hold their politicians to account more on, and are therefore willing to demonstrate that in our own lives as well.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Karen. I know there are lots of people wanting to ask questions. There is another opportunity to do that, and I know that Karen is able to stay around. Caroline, unfortunately, is not, needs to go. I wanted to come back very briefly to your question about you know, what can we do in impact in terms of a research community in which the results are published through academic journals in a peer-reviewed process that emerges into the light of day in 20 years' time. There is a sense, of course, in which you're absolutely right, and it's why we're working with industry, with policy, with business communities, with arts communities, to try and translate that impact into practice right now. But there is also a sense, and it's a well-known quote, of course, that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And there is a sense that what we're doing is kind of investing in an intellectual agenda that is really critically important for the next 20 years. And almost unashamedly so, I think, as a research organisation, we have that responsibility, actually, to invest in that way in the long term. There's an even, the second best time to plant a tree is now. And just in recognition of the time that Caroline and Karen have sent, and it also comes from that question, because I was asked it 16 years ago when we launched another research group, what's your research actually going to achieve? One of the things that our research this time is going to achieve is the planting a few more trees. And so I would really like to just offer, as a token of our appreciation and an investment into the future, Caroline, that's a silver birch, which you will find someone at the back who will help you with some packing of that. But I'm told that silver birch symbolises new beginnings and protection. And that is probably something that you are really going to need as the Green MP going forward. Thank you very much. And this, to Karen, is an Irish oak, which symbolises wisdom, truth and courage, and with the very best wishes for your endeavours going forward. Thank you very much to Karen and Caroline.
Thank you.